Hello and welcome to our audience members joining us from across the globe. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. We're happy to be hosting this very timely program following the latest National Assembly elections in Kuwait, which took place a week ago, and a lot more events have happened since. So it's a great time to get an update from two of the top Kuwaiti analysts that we know to help us make sense of the results and what they mean for the country's present and future. I will introduce the panel here very quickly and then share the speakers' full bios with you in the chat. First, I'm happy to welcome back our good friend Al-Saif. He is a non-resident fellow at AGSIW and an assistant professor of history at Kuwait University. He focuses on the modern history and contemporary affairs of the Middle East. He is a recipient of various awards, co-founder of several NGOs, and has published numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. He has previously held senior roles in the private and public sectors in Kuwait, including Deputy Chief of Staff to a former Prime Minister. I'm also happy to welcome for the first time Shamael al-Sharikh. She is an independent Kuwaiti political analyst and activist for women's issues. She has plenty of practical experience when it comes to elections in Kuwait, having worked on election campaigns for candidates running in the National Assembly in 2006, 8, 9, 2012, 2016, and 2020. She is also a former board member of the Women's Cultural Society, Cultural Social Society, the oldest women's nonprofit organization in the Gulf region. Previously, she was a member of the Executive Office of the National Youth Project, an initiative by the Kuwaiti Emir Diwan to address youth concerns and advance their role in forming the country's future vision and development. Moderating this session today is AGSIW's in-house Kuwait expert, Dr. Kristin Diwan. She's a senior resident scholar at AGSIW, where she focuses on generational change, nationalism, and the evolution of Islamism in the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Her analysis of Gulf affairs has appeared in many publications, among them Foreign Affairs, Financial Times, and the Washington Post. She was previously an assistant professor at the American University School of International Service and has held various positions at the George Washington University and Georgetown University. And with that, Kristin, over to you.
Thanks, Raymond. I'm going to take the opportunity to update my bio too, because I'm actually teaching a class at George Washington University. I know that Badr is also working with some George Washington University students as well. So maybe we can give a shout out to our George Washington University students the start of this discussion. But I'm really thrilled to be here with both Dr. Badr and with Shamael as well, to have this discussion about the Kuwaiti elections, one of my favorite topics. And of course, before we get a lot into the details, just a little lead in for this. We know that these Kuwait elections took place after an early dissolution of the parliament. We know that that is not unusual in Kuwait's history. Of course, we know that that has often happened along with government shuffles as well. But there were some different kind of things leading up to this shift and this election. In particular, that I think gave some different signs about where Kuwait might be heading. We did have a new prime minister that was appointed in advance of the elections, the son of the emir, Ahmed al-Nawaf, al-Sabah. We do know that the cabinet as well that he had was working with at that point, then before the elections, was also taking some positive moves, I think, at least from a popular perspective in Kuwait, making some indications of listening to sort of Kuwaiti appeal for more reforms. And we had a very significant speech given on behalf of the emir by the Crown Prince Meshal, al-Ahmed, al-Sabah, which Badr wrote about it for us. Maybe we can put that up as well in the chat room to look at that, which occurred about on the 2-year mark for the new emir. So there were some signs of some shifts in the Kuwaiti political environment up in advance of the election. So I'm really thrilled to have this opportunity to get into the details and the outcome of that election and to think about what they mean for what we might be seeing in the Kuwaiti political environment writ large. So before we jump into the details, because I know that we could often do that in Kuwait. And Kuwait discussions often lead into a lot of details about the domestic political environment, of course. I thought I would just start by asking both of you to give me sort of your main takeaway from these elections. What surprised you or what struck you as important in the outcome of the elections? So can we start with you, Shamael?
Sure. Well, what struck me is the return of Ahmed Sadoun, the current MP who has nominated himself or has said that he'd like to become a Speaker of the House, has returned after after a 10-year retirement. And he had been very vocal about not wanting to participate in the one vote system. Not only did he gain a remarkable amount of voters, but he seemed to be rallying a unifying voice for change in Kuwait, which is ironic considering that you're not really changing, you're bringing back the old. But the popularity that he has had has shown that what you need to run the National Assembly in the future is a stable force, an experienced force, and someone who can understand the language of the, let's say, of the old guard within the government, but at the same time can be sort of a guiding force for the younger members of the National Assembly, and perhaps even the younger members of the royal family if we continue with the trend of cooperation. The second takeaway is that all members of the opposition, bar none, won their seats again. So this is a unified stand within the National Assembly. Unlike previous ones where there are factions, there was a very much unified effort within many of the MPs that were the most vocal, and they all made it with flying colors. So that's also something that shows that this could be the beginning of stronger coalition building. So, and of course, the main takeaway would be the return of Shiites. We have now 9 Shiites compared to a much lesser number in the National Assembly. And this is very common when we have more Islamists. They tend to balance themselves out. The members of the opposition that we won their seats, the majority of them had an Islamist flavor. And whenever you have a strong Islamist influence, somehow you end up having a strong or maybe slightly stronger Shiite influence. So the interesting thing is to see how that balance of power plays out after the 11th of October.
Thank you. It's a great start, and there's so many things that we can dive into there. So a lot of themes for us to draw upon afterwards. Badr, would you like to tell me what your kind of main takeaway was from these elections?
Sure. Happy to be back. I wanted to step back first and look at the regional context, Kristin, because this also played out in the election and its aftermath. And it's good to note and good to remind ourselves and others that the value of representative politics in the Middle East can never be underestimated. And the importance of the hard-earned freedoms the Kuwaitis have fought very hard for. So the ability to peacefully demonstrate, protest state measures, be heard by the highest authorities is something that is a given in many countries, but it's not the case in the Middle East, where, as you know, freedom of expression around us is sometimes fought with blood and tears. And we have many who are struggling to make ends meet, whether in civil wars or failing states surrounding us. So I think we need to pause and commend that there is such a system in place, no matter how imperfect that system is. So that's a first. Another thing is, many would claim that Kuwait has had an election overdose. And you've noted that briefly at the beginning, that we keep going about it. But look, this is also part of the system. It's within the constitutional bounds. Real politics, in its own localized versions anywhere, has not meant a smooth sailing for most. And despite next month our celebration of 60 years of constitutional rule, we still have a lot of growing pains that need to be looked into. And I have written and expressed elsewhere the need to relook the constitution and to relook how to move forward with the system, given the many issues that get at the root of Kuwait's problems, as opposed to cosmetically going over them. Now, let me quickly go over my impressions of this election. And let me go through the headlines that we tend to hear. This is an era of change. This is a new page in the country's evolution. This, to me, needs to be held into check. I mean, look, we're battling change and continuity. And while there has been some changes, and Shamael has alluded to some of them, we are covered by a veneer, a thick veneer, if you may, of continuity. And the one thing that struck me is we could say that this was one of the cleanest elections in our history, if we are to judge by the government's non-interference, if we're to judge on them confronting head-on vote buying, primaries, transfer of voters, tying voting to the place of residence. But let me go into where I think there has been some residual continuity. And that's, I mean, many have come out with the 54% change ratio. And to me, this number is inaccurate.
4% in terms of those
in terms of MPs. So over half of the MPs have changed. And as you know, 50 MPs, many have said that 23 have returned only. But those 23 have to be factored in with the 11 former MPs. So if you add the two numbers together, in reality, you have an unchanged political class.
So these are 11 MPs, just to be clear, that weren't in the last parliament, but that had been parliamentarians previously.
Indeed, indeed. And given the election overdose, that means they haven't been former MPs too long ago. So we're talking only about 16 new MPs, really. Now, in terms of programming or programs, and I'll end on this note, this was interesting for me to monitor. It was more of a spice-free, spiceless election. Anti-government rhetoric has been absent for a while. I hope the government enjoyed it while it lasted, because we saw what happened yesterday with the new government formation. But I think, funnily, given that there wasn't much of an agenda or campaigns that are focused on real programs, the country's identity did take center stage. And here I'm talking the values pledge, which we can get to later on.
Okay. Well, let me stick with you for a minute, and I want to actually underline your opening comment, which maybe isn't appreciated enough in Kuwait, or definitely in this era, where we know democracies worldwide are going through quite a bit of challenge. Fair enough. But let's talk a little bit about the lead-in to this election and how that may have colored things. We know that the dissolution of the parliament actually came about through a sit-in that took place by a number of MPs that were trying to force actually this shift, or at least a movement in the political scene, a constitutional sit-in. And this came after basically a interpellation of the prime minister that resulted in clearly, this is Sabah al-Khalid, the prime minister, which resulted clearly in what was going to be a vote of no confidence in him and his resignation at that point, but the failure then of the leadership to appoint a new government. So Kuwait had been in this point of limbo up until the point of the constitutional sit-in. We know that then in response to this action, that the government, the leadership actually did appoint a new prime minister, who is the current prime minister, who was appointed after the election as well, and called for the new elections. So I'm just wondering, Badr, if you could say a bit about how you think that lead into the elections affected the outcome, or kind of the mood of the elections. And I think you kind of alluded to it a little bit there, as well as the speech. And you can be feel free to talk a little bit about the speech that was given, the Emiri speech that the Crown Prince gave on his behalf leading into the election. How did that shift the context for the current elections?
Whenever the elections are held with a lot of simmering demands that go ignored for a while, but then they are met last minute, you'll see a high turnover for the opposition. They'll win over. And this has happened in 2012 in the parliament that ended up being annulled, which would be interesting to compare to what's going to happen down the line with this one. Now, the speech to me was very interesting, and it attracted me to comment a bit on the governance style that we have been seeing some elements of here and there in the last 2 years. there has been a concerted effort for a strategic pause, trying to take stock of the system as it evolves. These are not new players on the scene, but the scene has been dominated by an omnipresent emir, the late Sabah al-Ahmed. So trying to figure out how to move forward with the system in ways that are pleasant to their own preferences is something that we're seeing. And clearly the strategic pause came with an extended olive branch. As you mentioned, we've had the change of prime minister, we've had the clear and uncalled for, but it was, volunteered, clear letting go of the voting of the prime minister and the ministers for the Speaker of the House and the committees. So those early olive branches are the measures that the leadership have taken to show that they are adhering to the system as they see it. Now, and I don't know if we want to get into this right now, but there was a lot of commotion over the formation yesterday of the government. And much of it, and I've tweeted about it yesterday as well, much of it makes sense in terms of those raised eyebrows, but the system is very clear in that the prime minister, let's start with the emir. He has the right to choose the prime minister, and he has. And the prime minister has the right to choose his ministers, and he has. Now, the onus is on us moving forward with that selection. My issue there is there has been a lack of change in the way things have been running. And that's where I go to the thick veneer of continuity, if you may, because a quota system continues untouched in the new government.
So you're talking about quotas in terms of the people that are appointed as ministers in the Kuwaiti government.
Indeed. There will always be some tribal components. There will be a Shiite component. Technocrats have been looming large in the setup, which is fine. But I think given the sensitivities of the situation, you need politicians at the helm, with all these technocrats probably supporting them as at an undersecretary level. And we were talking about this right before the program started. This is the quickest government formation in Kuwait's history.
Yeah.
Within hours of being appointed, the prime minister issued his decree. So I'm not sure if there needed to be that rush, as opposed to reading the results of the elections, consulting with different groups and factions to avoid where we ended up with the quickest, again, resignation in Kuwait's history, minutes after the announcement, and with the high number of unsatisfied MPs, which, by the way, reminds us of something that happened in the 1960s, when a government was formed and they were not happy with some of the ministers, and the prime minister at the time called for the dissolution between him and the emir at the time, and the emir asked for a change in government. So we may see something along those lines in the next few hours or few days.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about that and bring in, I think, the main point of your lead point, Shamael, about the election of Ahmed Sadoun as a MP, or the return of Ahmed Sadoun, the venerable former Speaker of Parliament. I think, let's see if we're all in agreement that he then is extremely likely to be the Speaker of this Parliament. Is that correct?
At the moment, no other MP has shown any interest in taking the position for the Speaker at the moment. Okay. We've had some MPs speak about wanting to be Deputy Speaker, and perhaps therein lies the debate and the negotiation that led to some of the ministers chosen, which were not in favor of most of the MPs. Mm-hmm. But to touch upon what Dr. Badr said, the question, the theme of the government running this particular election was what we say in Arabic, tasheeh al-masar, rectifying the path. So we were told or the Kuwaiti people, the Kuwaiti voters were told as voters to choose wisely. And from their standpoint, they did. They made the change. They brought in some of the old guard, people like of a different generation, people who are known to be more calming forces than revolutionary forces. Even if they are staunch members of the parliament, they're not as revolutionary as some of the younger ones. There were some quasi open-minded liberal young progressives there. So this new composition of the National Assembly is different from what we had to deal with. And yet the cabinet stayed the same. So how can I rectify the path if you are not rectifying your stride? If you're not matching the level of change that I'm matching, we have an issue. We can't go down this path together. And I'm a bit surprised that the government did not realize that earlier. Their actions were quite substantial. I mean, these are not olive branches that they were given. These are almost olive trees. They've surrendered a lot. So seriously, the attitude for change was there. What happened last week that made them think, no, we can get away with putting in a cabinet that clearly was not aligned with the previous MP? So why would they be aligned with them now that they've been reelected? So that shows that the rate of change needs to accelerate within the government in order to meet the rate of change within the National Assembly.
Well, can I just follow up with that and ask you just to get a little bit more specific about the kind of change that you think is desired? Because, and especially, let's just focus a little bit on the term, I think you both use the term opposition, return of a lot of the opposition MPs. And I find it a bit challenging these days to identify exactly what opposition means in a Kuwaiti context in terms of substance. We know in the previous parliament, opposition largely meant opposition to the prime minister, Sabah al-Khalid, who is now removed and or resigned and not returned, and to the Speaker of the Parliament, Marzouk al-Ghanem, who as well did not run and did not return. So we know that there has been a turnover in leadership. As you said, we have at least a turnover and the return of Ahmed Sadoun as a presumptive, somewhat unified leader of this strong parliament. But what is it that the opposition is seeking in a new government composition and in a government program or even a parliamentary program? What kind of change or what is the agenda that is on offer?
In a nutshell, an opposition member is someone who is against corruption. That's the broad definition that combines most of them, that they have declared or have taken action that they stand against corruption, whether it comes from the executive branch or it comes from the legislative branch. Okay. Now, what platform they have? None, because they have different factions. They're not working in a coalition. They're not on the same ticket. What programs that might be useful for members of the 4th district are completely different from those from the 3rd or 2nd district. There are some unifying causes, something called the things related to political speech, freedom of political speech, of what's called the Al-Shamil, people suggesting that Kuwaitis who have chosen to exile themselves outside of Kuwait out of fear of persecution should be allowed to return, because there were instances where they've spoken against previous members of government. They should not be held accountable for it after so many years. So that would be one issue that is very popular among the 4th and 5th districts, because many of them are from those socioeconomic classes. Other issues might be related to
for those who don't know Kuwait geography that much, 4th and 5th districts are what we think of the outer districts of Kuwait.
The outer, yes.
So if you want to think of it in a US context, these would be not the urban center. I mean, all of Kuwait's pretty urban, but not the urban center. So I guess this would be the sort of outer districts.
So the other unifying issue would be electoral reform. That's been a battle cry among many of the MPs, men, women, from all the districts. Electoral reform, especially what is referred to as tickets, the unifying ticket. So where people would not be part of a party, but part of a unified ticket where you would vote for a group of people, and that way it will allow for more representation. Of course, and procedural reform and how the National Assembly actually passes laws so that the government wouldn't have so much clout in voting in. So these are the major issues that they've been mentioned. The degree of commitment varies because they don't have a platform. They just have speaking opportunities during the election. And now that we have this issue with the parliament, their unifying platform is that they don't want to work with this cabinet. And the ball is in the government's court to answer that request.
Okay. Maybe can we dig down a bit, because I know Shamael said that she mentioned that to some degrees the call from the leadership of a shift in the thinking of the population and to return a parliament with a different mindset to some degree was answered. But can we talk a little bit more about exactly what the composition of this parliament looks like in terms of substance? I know one thing we will want to talk about is this values document that was put forward and exactly how that affected the election, and sort of what are the substantive positions of members in the parliament, or is substance really the leading issue in the Kuwaiti parliament, and is it more about representational politics? So I don't know, Badr, if you want to kind of start with that. I kind of threw a lot out there, but basically I'm trying to get at what was the composition of how you would like to characterize the composition of this parliament after these.
Let me first comment on the opposition idea, because I toy with that idea a lot in the Kuwaiti context as well. It's a fluid concept in which you see people shuffling back and forth. And I think the onus is on the executive branch for it to customize or cap the size of opposition. Because what it all boils down to is the government and its large apparatuses fulfilling, the needs of citizens, whether it be health, housing, education, infrastructure. If these things are being met, there wouldn't be a need for these issues to be raised over and over again in what seems to be an endless recycle mode of issues and personnel. Now, I have much to say on corruption and what corruption entails and how to define corruption. And there is more that needs to go into it, starting with us dialoguing amongst ourselves within Kuwait on how to define corruption. Because depending on the definition, you'll end up with many will be culpable, in both branches, if not beyond. So I think starting with a code of conduct, looking back at how we can function as a state, these are, close to existential questions maybe, but those are the type of questions and discussions that we need to have as a people if we want to move forward, as opposed to looking at X or Y and Z in terms of limited issues. Now, again, the government, everyone is now rallying about the parliament going against the government formation, but it was frankly in the government's hand. If they took on that position clearly, in which the litmus test for many of those that ran and won was respect for the constitution, as Shamael has mentioned. So the one translation of that respect is not to bring in those that voted in an anti-constitutional way, if you may, with the delay of interrogations. That was taken seriously. And if that would be the text that everyone rallies around, then there needs to be some kind of respect towards the letter of the text. Now, again, there could be arguments on the other side that this was a tactical move that wasn't meant to be implemented. But given the spirit of the moment, in which there is that concerted marketing of a new page, then you might as well, continue the job of new faces, because, you've changed the prime minister. There will be soon a new speaker of house. We even have a new attorney general. So there is that buzz of change. So why then bring in close to half of the previous government? So those were the questions that need to be answered. And look, lurking in the back of my mind, frankly, is the second part of that speech that we heard on June 22, which spoke about, and I translated it to forceful measures, إجراءات ثقيلة الوقع والحدث. These should be taken seriously. Not much discussion has taken place on what kind of forceful measures. I tried to, innovate or think somewhat outside of the box and give a scenario, but that could be one of many scenarios. And I mentioned martial law, which is prescribed in the Constitution, by the way. So I see these coming back soon, because it doesn't seem like a plausible scenario for us to continue recycling parliaments and continuing that path of the solutions.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've kind of invited you to get into what the way I would say usually people dissect kind of Kuwaiti elections, which is, okay, well, how many members do we get from this tribe and this tribe? How many women were elected? Which we should talk about that. Of course, we did have the return of women into this parliament, given that the last parliament didn't have any women amongst the 50 members, and now we have 2. How many Shia were elected? I think there is that tendency to, on first cut, you look at the tribal representation and of these different interest groups, how many from the Islamic constitutional movement, how many Salafis. But it's interesting. I think this whole way that this conversation has gone has not been along that course. There's been a desire to go with the spirit of the election, which was about change and kind of change in the way that the Kuwaiti political system is organized. Is that appetite really there on the ground? Do you see that, Shamael, or do you think those divisions that do exist in the parliament, the understandable kind of representational divisions, are still going to be at play as these politics shape up?
I'm glad you brought that point, Dr. Kristin. We do have representational politics, but what this election saw was a thawing of identity politics that we are traditionally used to. We saw more voting along conviction than tribal lineage. And I say that very loosely. I'm not saying that there weren't people that were voting according to tribe and sect, but we saw certain MPs cross border lines and deliberately target members of factions that would never have voted for them. This could be, of course, due to the fact that the company changed the structure of the areas where you vote, where you get to vote with the civil ID instead of certain districts. So they kind of, from a non-Kuwaiti perspective, they increased the number of voters in certain areas, which introduced a whole new constituency for some of the MPs that are more on the periphery. So you saw a lot of the periphery MPs targeting periphery populations to which they do not belong.
Okay.
The second thing that we saw, again,
there were more constituents added to these outer districts that we were talking about, the 4th and 5th district, which to be mentioned actually has a much larger electorate, which is kind of an issue in Kuwait. I would think that the number of people that the number of votes that it takes to be elected in those districts is much higher than in other districts.
Indeed, and that is actually one of the problems and the challenges that we face in our electoral system. It's not just the way we vote, whether it's an individual vote or per ticket, but rather where we vote. And whether these districts have been geographically arranged to be equal and proportionate. Mm-hmm. The other thing that shows that the thawing of this identity politics is that tribal women are now seeing themselves as women and not as tribals, and that shows why you have certain candidates that would have never seen the light of day in previous elections actually have a fighting chance. Now, one of the MPs one of the candidates that ran in the 4th district, she didn't make it, but she put up a fantastic fight as Moudi al-Mtairi, which is unheard of that a tribal woman, would get the amount of votes that she did. She lost the election, but she lost with flying colors, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. And that shows that no longer are tribal women identifying as members of a tribe, but they're identifying as women with their own causes. This is new. It's still nascent.
And I heard, sorry to interrupt you, but I heard as well that she got a lot of support by demanding that others debate her, that she was wanting to call for a debate. Is that correct?
She did call for a debate. Nobody debated her. She wasn't, unfortunately, by members of probably maybe some of the male voters, maybe she wasn't taken so seriously, but she certainly was taken seriously by the female voters, and they gave her quite a number. So it shows that while it's in the early stages, we might be facing a new type of identity politics based on certain convictions and not just ethnic or sectarian identities.
Yeah.
If I can jump in, this is the biggest, I agree with Shamael, and this is the biggest takeaway from this election, the ability to move beyond identity politics. Once there was a small step towards fixing that electoral system, Now let's reimagine for a moment if we go for districts and representations that are more, fair and just in representation. What kind of outcome will you get? I think it would be closer to the notion of a civil state, which is what the country is all about. Now, to me, the loss of Moudil Mtayri is more important than the victory of Ali Al-Khalid and Jinan Boushahri, to be honest.
I agree.
And we
These are the
saw
two women that were elected to parliament.
indeed. So we have two women, and those won, but the Moudil Mtayri lost, but she had a good campaign going on with no resources, by the way, which speaks to the appetite for change that is out there. And let me say this too, many have crossed borderlines in terms of male candidates talking about intersectional gender politics. I've noticed some Islamist candidates preparing for women-only lectures in a serious manner, as opposed to it being a tag-along to the male audience, if you may. This isn't something that we've seen. And let's not forget, for the first time in our history, we have 2 MPs win behind prison bars.
Yeah.
So that's, again, another sign of fighting. That's because of the primaries that took place, and there were some claims that they were implicated along with some of their supporters, and that's moving forward. But that shows you that there is something into the landscape that's a bit different than before.
But does that speak to, these were two individuals who had accused of running in tribal primaries, right? That had participated in these things that are run in advance of elections to help certain tribes unify their votes behind one candidate and to improve their chances of making it within the general election. Is that correct? So is that an indication of sort of the ongoing challenge of these kinds of politics in Kuwait, or is it an indication of the government coming down harder on that? Is that one of the things that actually led to this shift away from identity politics, or how do you interpret that element?
Is it me or Shamael? Shamael.
Okay. I'll take a bit if you don't mind. In terms of how the two gentlemen that were temporarily incarcerated, by the way, since then they've both been freed, won the elections, I think goes down to what Kuwaitis are when they become voters. They're really emotional and they love an underdog story. So there was no way that these gentlemen's constituents would have let them go without trying to save them, if you will.
Okay.
Having said that, there might have also been a conviction that they participated in primaries in the previous elections when everybody was doing it and the government didn't blink an eye. So why do you hold it on their head now? Is it because you're going to be more members of the opposition, or the so-called the alleged opposition in the widest terms? So there's the sense of don't implement the law harshly on people who might be your opponents in the discussion. Implement the law fairly and equally and in an egalitarian manner, or just let us do what we want. And the fact that both gentlemen have now been released from incarceration shows that there may be a chance that the government might rethink their particular situation, not the stand against primaries, that's still illegal, and they were quite firm in that. But those two particular situations, because they happened in previous primaries, they might just let it slide this one time.
Okay.
This transitional mode that the country is going through is very interesting, because each party is trying to sense what the limits of the other party is. And as we go through this, we're going to end up with a different manual, if you may, of how the country runs and moves forward. And hopefully that doesn't get complicated with the forceful measures down the line, because it is complicated as it is. And that's where the rule book needs to be clarified. And it hasn't been. It's been on the go kind of attitude, in which now we know that there is a very clear signal from government that tribal primaries are no longer tolerated. Whereas, as Shamael mentioned, they turned a blind eye in the past. So and more of these steps will be shown as time moves forward.
Well, let me ask, we do have a lot of questions. I need to start getting to those. I was so engaged in our conversation. I forgot I should turn to our Q&A, and we do have quite a lot, actually. But I do, before I do that, I do want to pick up on that one hint that you've dropped a couple of times, Badr, about this idea of the speech that was given by the Crown Prince about, we're going to be cooperative, we're moving on to elections, but choose wisely, or we'll move on to forceful measures. And how much that does sort of both the way this electoral turnout happened and that speech ahead of time in the warning does kind of raise one's mind towards the 2012 elected parliament. This was a parliament that came in the midst of, it has to be said, kind of this Arab Spring movement of a lot of demands coming from the public, from below, a lot of street protests at that time and the like, youthful protests, elected a very oppositional parliament at that time. That parliament, it's fair to say, started on a foot that was not unifying by putting forth some very strong Islamist positionings that divided. I think it's fair to say the public. I mean, obviously it had some popular support, but divided the public. And then that whole parliament became dissolved over a constitutional issue. And after that, then we had, of course, the shift in the government electorate, which has been a controversial way that the parliament is elected. What lessons are you saying that we should take? And you did mention before about this 2012 parliament. So I'm wondering, is that something we should be looking back at as an eye to what could be a similar fate of this parliament? Or are you more optimistic that they will escape this fate? Or what lessons should they take to avoid that?
They need to focus on unified agendas. They need to steer away from divisive modes, divisive programs. And they need to really think of how to move forward with citizens in their mind as the priority, not egos, not personal initiatives. And let me give a different twist to the various attacks that the MPs have had for the new government yesterday. Yes, it could be seen as an interference in the affairs of the executive branch, but some of those have come out in a different attitude. It's them, the MPs, saying that we want to work with you. We want this to work forward. Don't push us to challenge you on, different fronts when it comes to working with problematic ministers. It came in that light. So I think there is that somewhat of an awareness that they need to move forward. Will they be able to let go of their, if you may, primal, instincts and not push for their own agenda items? I tend to be on the pessimistic side, to be honest. I mean, and I'm going here as a historian with the record, and that's what we've seen all along. Yeah.
Shamael, I'll give you a chance to answer along those lines, and I'll throw out which was actually a question that was offered by Alexa Parks, which is that the new cabinet was announced recently, obviously, and what are the thoughts that the new cabinet's how will this cabinet's relationship be with this newly elected parliament in the short and long term? So better suggesting that obviously we know that the new cabinet has already fallen due to, we didn't mention it, but because of an MP also refused to serve on it. But what do you think are the prospects for, just as Badr mentioned, for presumably Ahmed Saadun working with the new prime minister in a productive way in the short and long term?
Ahmed Saadun will be looked at as somebody who can keep the more staunch members of the previous opposition in check. Sheikh Ahmed al-Nawaf will be looked at as somebody who can appoint ministers the National Assembly can work with. So each person has a KPM that they need to fill, and it's a very easy KPM to fill if they choose wisely. Now, unfortunately, Ahmed did not really choose the team. They were elected by the people. Sheikh Ahmed al-Nawaf can choose his team. And it's okay to get it wrong the first time. That's all right. And I do believe, to the credit of some of the ministers, they resigned. Some of them were told on the news that they resigned willingly. Now it's his chance to work with the National Assembly and to see what kind of team would work well with them. It's a very collaborative effort. It's very new. This is not the way we do things in Kuwait. Like I said, we're used to having one aspect of the government, which is the legislative branch, shed their skin every now and then the other stays the same. And that's not the rate. We need to equalize the rate of change there. So in order for progress to be achieved, for us to move forward, Sheikh Ahmed al-Nawaf needs to understand and read the reactions that he's seen today, and to hopefully choose a cabinet that can be that can meet the government's needs without aggravating the National Assembly's plans.
Okay. But maybe you can answer. We have a question from Sarah Maliki along those lines with the government relations with the new Majlis. He's asking, how will that impact their relationship? How will that impact much needed key economic reforms in Kuwait, such as the delays in budget? And more generally, to the degree that we're talking about oppositional politics within the National Assembly, will these populist politics also impact how oil revenue windfall is spent? So on the economic side.
Let's not forget that the budget that's usually passed early summer has not passed yet. And we've been waiting on this new parliament to come through with the government to then go ahead and pass it hopefully soon. I mean, again, 2/3 unchanged political class in parliament, quite populist, protective of the economic benefits that citizens have. I think that you'll see more of that. Again, the onus is on a very active government to do its job, to convince those MPs, and if needed and even encouraged, I would say, to go straight down to the street and market their own vision, market their own plans. And if they have, enough support, they can pass through these measures, which are needed, by the way. We keep saying this with every election cycle, with most reports on Kuwait. There is no country that can depend on one source of revenue forever. If you go back again to Kuwait's history, this is the exception, not the norm. We're not going to have another 60 or 70 years of the same status. So that alternative thinking, which is in the minds of many, needs to translate into a different set of agendas.
Okay. I'm just going to read in total, and you can respond to this. Another comment from Ali Al-Salim. Tangible progress. Someone please point to it in terms of educational outcomes, employment prospects, economic dynamism, environmental quality, regional competitiveness, the things that truly matter. We are reorganizing the chairs on the deck of the Titanic. These intellectual discussions are superfluous at best. So I think that kind of speaks to your desire better for some real substantive changes. I find it interesting that a lot of this conversation has been very much like Kuwaiti politics often are, along the ideas of sort of institutional shifts or governance shifts, or how the government relations should be built. Are you seeing that as a prerequisite? And maybe Shamael, you can answer this, to get to these, issues that really are the concrete issues that I think everyone wants to see move forward. Or are you optimistic that this can actually take place under this new parliament?
Well, to answer the first part of your question, they have to be institutional shifts, because these are the powers that be that control the economic institutions that set the power. They can control the regulatory framework that draws in foreign direct investment. These are the even the education. I mean, the government sets the education. So we have to discuss these important institutional changes in order for us to instill change and have it trickle down from the top. This is the Middle East. Most things trickle down from the top. We don't have, at the moment, strong organic movements to bring change. As a matter of fact, the last time you had a strong organic movement to move a change was Karamat Watan in 2012. And that was aligned with what was going on with the rest of the Middle East in terms of the Arab Spring. So we need to start at the top, because the last time things started at the bottom, they went awry very quickly, and the top got dangerously aggravated. So what we're working about here is the person who asked this question is 100% correct. We need to talk about sustainability, climate change, development, growth, opportunities for employment outside of the oil sector or of the government sector or of any traditional sector. We need to think about digitization, These are all important questions, but we cannot do any of that if we don't have a government. And as it stands, right now, on the 6th of October, 2022, Kuwait does not have a government.
Let me add to this. I agree with Ali's comment. And look, on top of the many issues, and I agree with Shamael on this, we need, on top of all of this, is a new way of thinking, an administrative overhaul. The way that the government runs, the bureaucracy in place does not function properly. It's not optimized to the needs of Kuwaitis. And let me give you an example. And I don't know if you guys noticed this. A few days ago, right before the formation of this current government, which is, invalid with the resignation of the MP minister, there was the 40th government, which was Sheikh Ahmed Nawaf's first, which was a 2-month-old government. Right after its resignation, the communications office of the government curiously put out a 4-minute video online they titled it "The Main Activities of the Government in These 2 months." And, the academic me made an Excel sheet of these activities, and I came up with 11 actions. Of these 11 actions, 2 are tangible achievements, which one was the decree that changed, the voting scheme and the addition of voters. And the second one was, and let me pull this out, was, opening up Winter Wonderland in the winter, which is, it serves the entertainment needs of Kuwaitis. Everything else is, let's take it to a committee. We're studying the allocation of the lands that the Defense Ministry gave to housing. We are gonna go through the Silk City plans. It's recycling the same thing over and over again. And that kind of mentality is not gonna work. Young Kuwaitis are needed in places of power. They have new ideas to change things around, but you cannot go with half-measured actions. You really need to support them full force. And if you do that, then you're gonna see the change that you need. Many claim, and it's the beginning bit that I started with, many claim that the parliament and the system has been the reason why we have lacked development. Well, look, the 1960s and the 70s, Kuwait was in its heyday, and we had active parliaments then. It's not so much about the parliament or the system, it's about how you run the country. And that's what we need to do.
Let me just ask, while we're talking about these concrete things, we did have a question from Justin Alexander, and I know this is something that often gets asked about Kuwait. Any hints of what Assadoun-led assembly will take on the longstanding fiscal issues, such as passing a debt law? Is the debt law even a big issue anymore? Either of you have a comment on that?
Will all depend on how the government promotes the debt law this time. It's all a question of this. The whole issue with the debt law is how the government manages our economic institutions as they are, and whether they are being managed accurately, professionally, or whether they are being left for graft and other types of cronyism that might lead to misuse of public funds. The question is not so much the debt law, which may be needed in the future. The question is how the government shows its future plans to manage an economy, a national economy that is stable, sustainable, and forward-looking. If they can prove that they can do that, maybe the debt law has a chance. At the moment, as it stands right now, I would recommend, if Assadoun is asking me for my opinion, or even if the Prime Minister is asking me for that, this would not be the first point of discussion at the moment, because we have a lot of economic reform required, a lot of regulatory reform required before we can even address or reapproach the debt law with this current parliament.
And let me say on top of that, we need some form of closure on the many cases of corruption. Not a single cent has come back to the coffers of the state. There wasn't any kind of closure in that sense. So that needs to move forward. I know the cases are being rechecked and relooked, but again, we need to think along different lines for this to move as needed with the debt law.
We do have a couple questions. We only have 5 minutes left, but I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we mentioned this values document. If one of you wants to go a little bit further into what initiated that and what it means in the Kuwaiti context. But we had a couple questions about an anonymous questioner. How concerned are you that theocratic norms will dominate the legislative arena with the non-secular democratic practice in Kuwait? Someone else, can you comment on the growth of Salafism in Kuwait? How is this affecting social and political dynamics? So just something, I know, I think you both are kind of eager to not emphasize those things, but if you can just speak a little bit to those questions, which are real kind of cultural politics within Kuwaiti state. Badr, do you want to take that? I know
it goes to Kuwait's identity. And we are a diverse society where there are various views on how to lead one's life. And I think they are bound to coexist, even if tensely, until they find a space in which they can share a bare minimum. We're not there yet. And that's why you see this big commotion about what kind of values do we drive our citizenry towards. And you find this in any healthy society, by the way, Kristin. It's not an anomaly for Kuwait. You see more of it in Kuwait as opposed to other countries. It's because of the relative openness that we have in there. But the same discussion you'll find in other Gulf states, for sure.
I'd like to add to that. That discussions between right-wing beliefs and left-wing beliefs are actually common, not just in the Gulf, but all over. There is a general move towards what's considered family values. Now, maybe in the Islamic context, people think we might be interpreted to a dangerous level that might bring out memories of extreme Islamists prone to violence. But to be honest, this is a valid opinion, not one I personally agree with, but it is a valid opinion. And that's the beauty of the Kuwaiti democracy as it is, that they can actually share it and we can disagree with it and we both go home safe and sound. So it is healthy to have these discussions. It is healthy to have these debates. It's not healthy for one side to force its opinion on the other or to use their clout within the National Assembly to Islamicize the laws or over-liberalize the laws. But it is important to keep the open discourse because at the crux of it, this is what Kuwait is. It's all about free, open discourse.
Can we just bring up, and I think I wanted to bring this up before, we didn't talk about the competition over the deputy speaker. And you talked about this change in identity politics. And since I know that one of the leading candidates is Dr. Hassan Johar, we did have a question about him running as deputy speaker. For those of you who don't know, Hassan Johar is Shia, but he's not running, I don't think, primarily on that kind of, as you put that issue. He has been a leading figure sort of in the, I guess what you would call a moderate cooperative opposition in the parliament. So can you speak a little bit to him and kind of his role within the parliament and how that fits in, both within the competition over the deputy speaker, how important that might be, and in line with these changes in identity politics that you were talking about?
But there's
if you would go ahead.
Hassan Johar, prior to the 2022 election, has proven through his actions that he is a trans-sectarian candidate and MP. And to me, to have a diverse set of individuals on one view, is safer than saying that a certain type of individual or group is the one that's leading change against the government. His presence among that opposition platform for a long time showed that national unity amongst Kuwait. And I think the time is ripe for him to take on that position when comparing the other candidates. Now, others could come in, but if you look at the other names, he is, along with Isa Al-Kandari, the two most, suitable candidates given their expertise and their long track record of working in the public sector and in politics. Isa Al-Kandari has been the deputy. So to my mind, and that leaves the floor open for Hassan Johar. And it would be a nice summary of Kuwait's story or narrative in general, in which we respect difference, we accept each other, regardless of our own personal beliefs.
Let me just, I think we're right at the closing time here. I want to be sure that I thank everybody who's joined us. We had some really excellent questions, not all of which I was able to get to. And I think a really rich and a different kind of conversation about Kuwaiti politics, which is really refreshing. So I thank you both for bringing that. I want to leave it and let you kind of finish with what you would like to, kind of how you see things moving forward. I will mention that we did have quite a few questions, though, about the regional context, about Kuwaiti foreign policy, but also just about kind of where Kuwait stands in the region and even with its National Assembly in the region. So I welcome you to discuss on that issue, but of course also to end on any note that you you would like to end. Shamael, if you want to start.
Sure. Okay. Well, I would like to say that the wise person would not be so optimistic about what's going to happen, but I am. I think the government might be finally a good listener. I think we might get a cabinet that's willing to collaborate with the National Assembly. And I hope that when they decide to do, they will focus more on finding a definition for the true meaning of civic duty and national identity building. Because in the end, this is what's going to build the nation, a unified civic duty towards serving the country and not self-serving goals, and driving the country together towards more growth and progress.
I share Shamael's optimism. Regardless of all the many loopholes and the many imperfections that we have had, do not despair. Kuwait has a system that's unique to it, and it's a system to be proud of. It's a system that needs a lot of work and development, but that's the whole point of doing politics.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you both for bringing this optimistic note to Kuwaiti politics. We will definitely be watching as we get a new government formation and to see if this new spirit of change and of ability of the two to work together really comes to pass. Also, I just wanted to mention, a lot of people have been asking if this will be available in recording afterwards. It will be. I believe you just check on the same site. We'll be circulating that, but it should be, I believe, on the same site where you checked in for this webinar. We'll be posting it again. I also just want to mention, too, that we will be having at AGSIW a Petro Diplomacy, our annual Petro Diplomacy conference. We'll be posting information about that shortly. That's coming up. I know there's a lot of interest in oil markets and in the politics of oil these days, so please be watching for that as well. And finally, just thank you to both of you for joining us, and I hope we'll have you back to have more discussions about Kuwait and other issues. Thank you.